The morning they started tearing down that mansion, I didn't feel victorious. Not the way people imagine when they hear the story. There were no cheers, no dramatic speeches, just a low growl of excavators warming up before sunrise, the smell of salt drifting in from the Pacific, and a strange kind of silence that only settles over a place after everyone finally realizes a mistake is too expensive to hide. If you'd driven past that stretch of coastline on Whidbey Island that morning, you probably would have thought it was just another construction project gone wrong. You would have been wrong. That house had never belonged where it stood. And deep down, everyone involved knew it. My name's Ethan Brooks. For almost 30 years, I'd lived on the same little piece of waterfront my parents bought back when shoreline property wasn't something billionaires collected like baseball cards. It wasn't a mansion. It wasn't glamorous. It was a cedar house with weathered shingles, a wraparound porch, and windows that caught every sunrise over Puget Sound. My dad used to say the view was worth more than anything we could ever build on it. And honestly, I believed him. Before he passed away, he spent 2 summers stacking the basalt rocks that form the boundary wall along the eastern edge of the property. Every stone had a place. Every survey pin had been professionally set. Every inch of that line had been recorded with the county years before GPS made things easier. Around here, people respected those old walls because they represented something bigger than rocks. They represented a promise that neighbors wouldn't have to fight over where one life ended and another began. For decades, nobody questioned it. Then, like so many stories these days, everything changed when money showed up. In the spring of 2016, a luxury development company bought the vacant lot next to mine. Within weeks, shiny pickup trucks started rolling in. Drones buzzed overhead taking promotional footage, and men wearing spotless boots walked around pointing at things they'd never planted and talking about maximizing ocean views. Their project manager was a guy named Grant Mercer. He couldn't have been much older than 40, always smiling, always wearing sunglasses, even when the sky was gray. He had that polished confidence some people mistake for competence. The first time we met, I was trimming back blackberry bushes along the wall my father built. He walked over, stuck out his hand, and said, "Looks like we're going to be neighbors." I shook his hand because that's what decent people do. Then I smiled and tapped the stone wall with the handle of my shovel. "Just so we're clear," I said, "everything on this side belongs to me." He looked at the wall for maybe half a second before flashing another perfect smile. "Don't worry," he laughed. "Our engineers handle all that stuff. It'll be beautiful when we're done." It wasn't what he said that bothered me. It was how quickly he stopped looking at the wall. Most people glance at a property line because they're curious. Grant looked through it, like it was already gone in his mind. I wrote the conversation in the little notebook I kept on the kitchen counter. My wife used to tease me about that notebook. Said I documented everything from suspicious weather to strange conversations at the hardware store. Maybe she was right. Maybe growing up with a father who believed paperwork solved more problems than arguments rubbed off on me. Months passed. Survey crews came and went. Heavy equipment cleared trees on the neighboring lot. Concrete forms appeared where empty grass used to be. Then my sister invited me to Oregon for her retirement party, and I was gone for just under 2 weeks. That's all it took. I still remember pulling into my driveway after the ferry ride home. Before I even turned off the truck, I heard nail guns echoing across the water. Fresh concrete has a smell you never really forget once you've worked around it, and it drifted all the way to my porch. Something didn't feel right. I grabbed my coffee, walked toward the old stone wall, and stopped dead. Rising out of the ground on the far corner of my property was the edge of a massive concrete foundation. Steel rebar stretched across grass I'd mowed myself less than a month earlier. The forms didn't just brush the property line. They crossed it. I stared for several seconds, honestly wondering if somehow I'd forgotten where my own land ended. Then I spotted the old stainless survey pin, still exactly where it had always been, sitting several feet inside their foundation layout. One of the foremen noticed me watching and walked over with the relaxed grin of someone who thought this conversation would last 30 seconds. "Morning," he said. "Don't worry about it. It's only a couple feet. Happens all the time." I looked from him to the survey pin, then back to the wet concrete slowly hardening under the morning sun. And that's when I realized this wasn't going to be about a few feet of land. It was going to become a test of whether some people really believed money could erase boundaries that had existed for decades. The foreman shrugged like he'd delivered the most reasonable explanation in the world, then wandered back toward his crew without waiting for my answer. I stayed there another minute, staring at that survey pin, sticking out of the dirt like it was the only honest thing left on the entire construction site. People always ask me why I didn't start yelling, why I didn't call the sheriff right then or jump in front of the concrete truck. The truth is, anger has a funny way of making you sloppy. And my father spent years teaching me that once you lose your temper, you usually lose the argument right behind it. So I went back inside, poured the coffee I'd forgotten to drink into the sink, pulled that little notebook off the kitchen counter, and started making phone calls instead. My first call was to Harbor Northwest Surveying, the same company that had updated my property records years earlier, after my wife insisted we have everything professionally documented. By sheer luck, the owner, a surveyor named Daniel Foster, answered himself. When I explained what I'd found, there was a long pause before he quietly said, "Don't touch anything. Take photographs from every angle, and I'll be there this afternoon." Those 6 hours felt longer than the previous 6 months. The construction kept going as if nothing had happened. Concrete trucks came and left. Framers unloaded lumber. Workers laughed during lunch breaks. Watching them build on land I knew wasn't theirs was one of the strangest feelings I'd ever experienced because every hammer swing made the eventual problem bigger, more expensive, and somehow more unbelievable. Around 2 that afternoon, Daniel arrived carrying enough equipment to map half the county. He barely said hello before setting up his GPS receiver over the original monument marker. For the next 3 hours, he walked the property in complete silence, occasionally making notes, occasionally asking one of his assistants to verify a coordinate. Grant eventually wandered over with the same relaxed confidence he'd shown the day we first met. "Everything okay over here?" he asked, smiling at Daniel. Daniel didn't even look up from his instrument. "I'm surveying a legal boundary," Grant laughed softly. "Our people already did that." Daniel finally raised his head. "Then one of your people made a very expensive mistake." The smile disappeared for just a second before returning, only thinner this time. "Let's not jump to conclusions." Daniel simply went back to work. 2 days later, I picked up the completed survey. I can still remember opening the rolled plans across my dining room table. Thick black lines marked my parcel. Bright red shading highlighted the intrusion. 342 square feet, not inches. Not a misunderstanding. 342 square feet of reinforced foundation, extending beyond the legal property line. Daniel had attached a signed statement that read in plain English, "The existing foundation and structural footprint occupy property legally belonging to Mr. Ethan Brooks." No dramatic language, no opinions, just facts. I emailed a scanned copy to Grant before dinner. 23 minutes later, my phone rang. "Ethan," he began, sounding almost cheerful. "Looks like we've got a minor issue." "Minor?" I almost laughed. "Your house is on my land." He ignored that. "Construction's already pretty far along. Nobody wants delays. Why don't we work something out?" "Like what?" I asked. "We'll compensate you." "How much?" There was another pause. "I don't know. 20,000? Maybe more." "Name a number." I walked onto the porch while he talked, looking toward the water where my father and I used to fish on summer evenings. Finally, I said, "Grant, this isn't a yard sale." He sighed. "Be realistic. Nobody tears down a multi-million-dollar home over a few feet. Then maybe nobody should have built one there." He ended the call without saying goodbye. The next week, the framing continued. Apparently, they believed money would eventually solve everything. Instead of arguing, I filed a formal complaint with Island County Planning and Development. I attached Daniel's survey, aerial photographs, copies of the recorded plat, historical survey records, and a timeline documenting every interaction I'd had with Grant since the day he first walked onto the property. The county inspector assigned to the case was a woman named Laura Simmons, who'd spent over 20 years dealing with shoreline permitting disputes. She arrived wearing muddy boots instead of polished dress shoes, which somehow made me trust her immediately. She spent nearly 4 hours inspecting the site before asking Grant's superintendent one question. Did anyone verify the original monument markers before excavation? The superintendent hesitated just long enough to answer the question without speaking. Laura wrote something on her clipboard. A week later, her report arrived. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't dramatic. It simply concluded that portions of the residence had been constructed beyond the permitted parcel and constituted an unlawful encroachment requiring legal resolution. Grant called again that evening, but this time he wasn't friendly. "You've turned this into something it didn't need to become." "No," I replied quietly. "Your crew did that when they poured concrete." His attorney contacted me next. The envelope was thick enough to make it look important, full of carefully worded paragraphs explaining how cooperative neighbors often resolved minor boundary issues through easements and financial settlements. They offered $75,000 for a permanent easement. $75,000 sounded like a lot of money until I realized what they were really buying wasn't land. It was permission to erase a legal boundary because correcting their mistake would cost far more. I filed the letter with everything else. Then another offer came. $100,000. Then $150,000. Every new proposal proved something they still refused to admit out loud. They knew they were wrong. They simply believed everyone has a price. Friends started calling after hearing rumors around town. Some thought I should take the money. Others said I'd already won because no court would ever order an entire mansion removed. Even my younger brother asked if I was being stubborn for the sake of principle. I thought about that conversation for days. Maybe I was stubborn. Maybe my father had been stubborn too when he spent those long afternoons stacking basalt rock instead of throwing up a cheap wooden fence. But then I'd remember his voice saying, "Boundaries only mean something when people respect them. The day they don't, you don't really own anything anymore." That sentence stayed with me as the court day finally approached. Walking into that courthouse, I wasn't trying to destroy anyone's dream home. I wasn't looking for revenge or headlines. I wanted exactly what I'd wanted from the beginning, for the property line to mean what every survey, every deed, every county record had said it meant for decades. I just didn't realize that before this was over, the judge's decision would become one of the most expensive lessons that development company had ever learned. The hearing lasted less than 40 minutes, and somehow that made the whole thing feel even heavier. I'd spent months collecting records, photographs, surveys, emails, inspection reports, and every conversation I'd written down in that little notebook. But when the morning finally arrived, there wasn't much left to say. Facts have a way of making long arguments unnecessary. Grant sat across the courtroom with two attorneys, looking far more tired than the confident developer who'd first shaken my hand beside my father's stone wall. Every few minutes, he'd whisper something to one of them, then glance toward me as if hoping I'd suddenly change my mind. I didn't look back very often. I was more interested in the judge, who spent most of the hearing quietly flipping through exhibits instead of listening to dramatic speeches. Daniel explained how the original monument markers had never moved. Laura testified that the county inspection confirmed the structure crossed the legal parcel boundary. Then Grant's attorney stood and argued that demolishing such an expensive residence would create an unreasonable hardship when a financial settlement could solve everything. The judge leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and asked one question that seemed to drain the room of every remaining excuse. If the plaintiff had built 342 square feet into your client's property, would your client accept a check and walk away? The attorney hesitated. Everyone noticed. Finally, he answered, "Probably not, Your Honor." The judge nodded once. Then this court sees no reason to apply a different standard simply because the defendant has greater financial resources. He looked down at the survey one last time before speaking words I'll probably remember for the rest of my life. The encroaching structure shall be removed in its entirety from the plaintiff's property, and the parcel restored to its original legal condition. That was it. No movie speech. No gavel pounding. Just a calm decision based on documents that should have been respected from the beginning. Outside the courthouse, Grant caught up with me in the parking lot. For a moment, I thought he was finally going to apologize. Instead, he shook his head and said, "You really burned a bridge over a strip of dirt." I looked at him for a second before answering, "No, Grant. You built a house across one." Then I got into my truck and drove home. Appeals were filed almost immediately, but each request was denied. The recorded surveys hadn't changed. The property line hadn't moved. Eventually, the demolition order became final, and on a gray Tuesday morning, almost a year after I'd first found wet concrete on my grass, the equipment rolled in. Excavators lined the road before sunrise. Structural engineers walked through the mansion making final notes while utility crews disconnected power and water. Curious neighbors gathered quietly along the shoulder, bundled in jackets against the cool coastal wind. Nobody celebrated. Even people who disagreed with me understood they were watching an extraordinary consequence unfold. The first hydraulic hammer struck just after 7. The sound echoed across the shoreline, followed by a cloud of pale concrete dust drifting toward the water. Walls that had taken months to build disappeared piece by piece over the next several days, floor by floor, beam by beam. The enormous house slowly surrendered to the same laws it had ignored from the beginning. I stood on my porch for a while that first morning, coffee in my hand, remembering my father stacking those basalt stones one at a time all those years ago. Back then, I never imagined his quiet attention to detail would one day outweigh millions of dollars in construction costs. Yet somehow it did. When the demolition was finished, crews removed every remaining fragment from my side of the boundary, graded the soil, and replanted native grass where the foundation had once been. The old survey pin was still there, scratched but untouched, exactly where it had always belonged. Sometimes visitors ask if I regret not taking the money. My answer surprises them. There were moments when life would have been easier if I'd signed the easement and walked away. I could have avoided months of stress, legal fees, and endless conversations with people who thought I was being stubborn. But every time I walked that property line at sunset, hearing the waves roll in and the wind move through the evergreens, I know I didn't protect a few feet of land. I protected the idea that rules have to mean the same thing for everyone, whether you own a modest family home or a mansion worth millions. If we'd started making exceptions based on price tags, then the property line would have stopped being a boundary and started becoming a suggestion. That's a dangerous way for any community to live. Even now, years later, people around town still argue about what happened. Some say I should have accepted the money because business is business. Others believe the court made exactly the right decision because ownership only means something if the law is willing to defend it. Honestly, I can understand why people see it differently, and maybe that's why this story still gets people talking. So now I'd like to hear from you. If you were standing in my shoes, would you have accepted the settlement and let the mansion stay? Or would you have fought all the way to the end, knowing it could force the entire building to come down? Let me know what you think in the comments because I'm genuinely curious where you draw the line between compromise and principle. And if stories about real property disputes, neighborhood conflicts, and unexpected courtroom victories interest you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share this story with someone who thinks a few feet of land could never change someone's life.